Welcome to the Ideal Investor Show. Join us on the journey to financial success. Let's go. Hey, hello. How are you doing? Welcome to another episode of the Ideal Investor Show. And today I'm basically going to give you a little bit of a scenario. And I want you to understand that I really don't care what happens with the elections or who is going to be elected or any of that. But obviously, it is kind of important for us as real estate investors to have an idea what might be coming our way. I wrote a little bit of a note on Substack this week. And when I say this week, I mean like the first week of October. And I wanted to have you as our audience also be aware there is a suggestion even progressed to the point where it's not just some people talking about it, but there's actually a regulation or law or whatever you want to call it that is basically being presented to Congress. So in theory, and I really want to emphasize, in theory, it could theoretically become law if it gets the necessary majorities in the Congress and the Senate. Do I believe that it will become law the way it's been presented and the way it's been written? No, most likely not. But it's still important for us to be aware what is being suggested, especially because we don't know yet what the outcome of the election is going to be. But at least in theory, it's possible that the outcome of the election, not just for who is becoming president, but also how many seats will the different parties have in the future Congress and Senate, create a situation where some new ways of doing things could become reality. And so one of these new ways that, interestingly enough, both candidates currently are actually addressing as a topic is housing, which is obviously just another word for real estate. And what they mean by housing is mainly how can we, and I'm saying it in my words, and you can probably tell that I'm not a big fan of politics to begin with, how can we bribe or make promises to the voters, and especially those voters who are currently unhappy? And if you ask yourself who are the most unhappy voters when it comes to housing, are those who have relatively low income and they can neither afford to buy a house or a condo or something like that, and they're really even struggling to pay their rent or find some place that they can afford for rent. And those numbers have grown quite a bit in the last few years. Obviously, no politician is going to take any responsibility for the fact that it has grown, but they now all are saying we need to do something about it. And in this new thing that they suggested, they basically said the following. What we want to do is we want to build 3 million units of housing per year. Now that is way more than what has been built by the overall market in the last few years every year. But the government seems to think they can do way more. Making that happen, the government wants to create a new department that is basically acting like a contractor, like a property management organization, like a marketing organization, almost a little bit like a turnkey provider. And that's one of the reasons why I actually kind of perked up and said, hey, what's going on here? So I know quite a bit about how a turnkey provider operates and what is necessary to allow a turnkey provider to be profitable. And this is where, in my opinion, this whole thing gets really, really shaky. But I want to first tell you what it is and then hear and invite you to give your opinion. So what the government is saying is, we want to build these units using this new department that the government is going to create, and we're going to put something like 10 billion or 50 billion or whatever kind of huge billion amount of money as a budget for this department. And so they then going to start building these properties. And we want them to build them to the most modern standards. We want them to build them to include sustainability measures, right? Like as few chemicals as possible. We also want them to build them with green energy in mind. So things like have solar panels on the roof, have maybe heat pumps for heating and things like that, have like LED lights everywhere, good insulation, all this kind of stuff. And that part I actually like, right? Because that's what should be done with modern construction. But we also know when you try to do that, that integrating all these things in a modern house is making that new house more expensive than a regular house where you don't do these things. Now, here comes the trick. The building itself, like literally making the house, is supposed to be only done by unionized labor, meaning like people who are like carpenters and masons and plumbers and electricians who are members of unions. So what does that mean? Union labor is typically significantly more expensive than non-union labor. So let's summarize what the government is saying. We're going to create a department that is going to act like a turnkey provider. They will use modern materials, modern technology, and union labor to build these properties. Now, you and I already know these properties will be more expensive to build than regular standard properties. Now, the government says, when it comes to renting them out, we will rent them out to a maximum of 25% of income to people with affordability issues. What does that mean? That means if somebody makes $5,000 or a family has $5,000 income, they can get a property like that for something like $1,200. But if somebody has $2,000 income, then they can live in that property for $500 in rent. How many 5,000 people are really social cases that the government would deem to be in need of help for this kind of housing? Not very many. The people that they claim they want to help are the people that make $2,000, $3,000 a month in income. And they say only a quarter of that income can be used for rent. So maybe $500, $600 on a house that is brand new and has been more expensive to build due to the materials and due to the union labor. What is obvious already is this new department is not just going to have to construct these properties. Even if we assume they would actually make that happen and pull that off, knowing that the government has always been much worse in doing anything like that than industry or the market. But if we assume they were to be able to pull this off, and we assume, and I think this is a fair assumption, that a brand new house has at least a normal lifetime of about 50 years, that for almost all of those 50 years, the government will have to subsidize every single house or every single apartment that they're building, because the rent will not ever be anywhere nearly enough to cover the cost or cover the mortgage. So it's just a huge hole of new debt that is being created. And obviously, if you can get a government-built property where you only need to use 25% of your income to pay rent, and anybody in the regular market has houses on offer that are more expensive, unless you are absolutely outside of eligibility, everybody will try to get into these brand new government subsidized houses, and the market for regular houses for regular people is gonna suffer, maybe get crippled. I don't think it makes any sense to do this, because for many, many decades, the government is going to create a new thing that is going to cost a lot of money, a lot of subsidies. Number two, this whole thing has been tried before. And what happens is when people get to live somewhere for such a low amount of money, of 25% of rent, the likelihood that they take good care of the property is very low. And that's exactly what has happened in the past when the government had what's called social housing. Within about 10 years, these properties looked awful. Number one, because the government is not very good at property management. But number two, because the tenants didn't really care for it. It was government provided. And so there was tons of damage and they were run down, and the government didn't really have anything in place to keep them up because it was already so expensive to just have them and pay subsidies for the rent. And then number three, the impact to the rest of the market is unpredictable, but most likely not good, because a lot of people who have been trying and stretching to be able to get into a different property, right now the levels for rent are somewhere between 30 and 40% for most landlords. They all will try to get into the ones that are 25%. And that is going to hamper the market quite a bit. So I have not really seen any positive thing, other than there's one little positive thing for the very first people who get into these brand new constructed properties, if that ever really happens. They will, for as long as they're in there, especially if they look after it, have the deal of a lifetime. Living in a brand new, green, sustainable, newly built property for a rent that's only 25% of their income. That's just an amazing deal. So that would be nice for those people. But for the rest of the population, for our tax dollars, for the market, and all these other things I mentioned, I believe it's a bad idea. So now that's where you come in. I would love for you to go to idealinvestorshow.com and hit the button to book a call. But you can also go on Apple or on Spotify and download this episode and give me feedback, give me some comment and say, okay, do you agree? Do you disagree? Is it a good idea that the government wants to get to be a landlord and a turnkey provider, or should it be left to us to create those companies and create these houses and create reasonable conditions where the rent level is still affordable, but we still, on the other hand, can cover our costs, because if the rent level is 25%, I can absolutely guarantee you that it will be cash flow negative. Absolutely guaranteed. So I look forward to find out what you're saying about this. Be well and stay safe, and I talk to you tomorrow.